Settle in. Nothing dramatic is about to happen. That would be historically inaccurate. Most people today hear the phrase, life expectancy in the Middle Ages, and immediately imagine that everyone dropped dead at the age of 30. This is not entirely wrong, but it is also not very relaxing, so we will approach it slowly, carefully, like medieval medicine should have, but usually didn't. When historians say that the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was around 30 to 35 years, they are not saying that people simply expired on their 30th birthday. Instead, they are quietly pointing out that an enormous number of people never made it out of childhood. Infant mortality was high. Child mortality was higher than anyone would prefer, and surviving to adulthood already placed you in a surprisingly exclusive club, one with no refreshments, poor hygiene, and frequent hunger. If you were born in a medieval village, your first challenge was simply staying alive long enough to remember your own name. Disease, infection, contaminated water, and malnutrition worked together in a way that modern public health officials would describe as deeply concerning. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and very little understanding of why people kept dying, except that it was usually blamed on God, bad air, or something your neighbor probably did wrong. Assuming you survived childhood, your odds improved slightly, not dramatically, just enough to justify continuing. Adults who made it past their teenage years could often live into their 40s, 50s, or even 60s, which was considered extremely old. These individuals were treated with a mixture of respect, suspicion, and the quiet assumption that they would soon die anyway. Life expectancy varied wildly depending on who you were and where you lived. Nobles had better access to food and shelter, but they also enjoyed risky lifestyles involving warfare, political intrigue, and banquets that encouraged overeating. Peasants worked constantly, ate poorly, and lived close to animals, but they sometimes avoided the deadly excesses of elite life. Either way, no one had it easy. This was not an era designed for longevity. Women faced additional risks. Pregnancy and childbirth were among the most dangerous events in a woman's life. Many women survived multiple births, but many did not. The absence of medical knowledge meant that complications were often fatal, and recovery depended largely on luck, resilience, and whether someone nearby had clean hands. Often, they did not. Disease arrived frequently and without warning. Plagues, fevers, infections, and mysterious illnesses swept through towns and villages with little resistance. When disease came, people did not isolate. They prayed, they gathered, they continued daily life until it became impossible. This approach was not especially effective, but it was consistent. Nutrition also played a major role. Medieval diets were repetitive and limited. Most people ate bread, grains, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat was rare for peasants and occasional for townspeople. During bad harvests, famine followed quickly. Prolonged hunger weakened immune systems, making even minor illnesses far more dangerous. Work itself shortened lives. Manual labor began early and continued without rest. Injuries were common, and even small wounds could become fatal infections. There were no safety regulations, no protective equipment, and no concept of taking time off to heal. If you could stand, you worked. If you couldn't, your situation became uncomfortable very quickly. And yet, despite all this, people lived. They married, raised children, worked, argued, laughed, and worried about the future. They did not feel like they were living in a short-lived era. They felt normal. Everyone around them lived the same way, died the same way, and accepted it with a level of calm that modern humans might find unsettling. Old age, when reached, was respected but physically difficult. Chronic pain, worn joints, poor vision, and untreated illnesses made daily life slow and uncomfortable. There were no retirement years filled with leisure. There was simply less work, fewer teeth, and a great deal of sitting quietly. So, when we talk about life expectancy in the Middle Ages, we are really talking about survival through layers of constant risk. Childhood was the first filter. Disease was the second. Work, hunger, and chance handled the rest. In the next part, we will look more closely at how childhood alone shaped medieval life expectancy and why surviving your early years was already a remarkable achievement. For now, you can rest, knowing that simply existing today already places you statistically ahead of most medieval villagers. Nothing personal, just history. We continue, gently, from where no one survived quickly. Childhood in the Middle Ages was not a warm, protected phase filled with learning and encouragement. It was a prolonged medical emergency that lasted several years. From the moment a child was born, survival depended on factors that were mostly out of everyone's control, including weather, food supply, and whether the local water source was quietly poisoning the entire village. Infant mortality was the largest single factor pulling medieval life expectancy downward. In many regions, up to a third of children died before their first birthday. Some did not survive their first week. Complications during birth, infections, and exposure to cold were constant threats. There were midwives, of course, but their tools were limited, their knowledge inherited rather than tested, and their success rate depended heavily on luck. Those who survived infancy faced the next challenge: early childhood. Diseases that are now considered routine inconveniences, measles, whooping cough, dysentery, were often fatal. Children were not isolated when sick. They shared beds, rooms, and sometimes floors with siblings and extended family. Illness spread efficiently, with impressive consistency. Nutrition during childhood was another problem that never fully went away. Weaning often happened early, sometimes before a child's immune system was ready. Food shortages meant thin porridge, stale bread, and long periods of hunger. Malnutrition weakened children, making recovery from illness slower and less likely. A child could survive a disease, only to be permanently weakened by it. Accidents also played a role. Medieval villages were not designed with child safety in mind. Open fires, wells, animals, sharp tools, and heavy labor equipment were everywhere. Children were expected to help with work as soon as they were physically capable. This meant early exposure to risk, and injuries that modern medicine could easily treat often became fatal infections instead. If a child made it to around the age of 10, their chances improved noticeably, not dramatically, just enough to justify cautious optimism. At this point, the body was stronger, the immune system more resilient, and daily survival became slightly less uncertain. This is why medieval records sometimes give the impression that people lived longer than expected. Those who survived childhood often lived for decades afterward. This statistical reality is important. Average life expectancy sounds like a personal countdown, but in the Middle Ages, it functioned more like a summary of collective risk. High child mortality compressed the average downward, making it appear that no one lived long, when in fact, many adults did after passing through several narrow gates of survival. Teenage years introduced new risks. Young men were drawn into physically demanding labor or military service. Injuries, exhaustion, and violence shortened many lives. Young women faced the looming danger of childbirth, which often began in the teenage years. Pregnancy placed enormous stress on bodies that were still developing, with no reliable medical intervention available. Marriage and family life did not slow things down. Work increased. Food needed to be shared. Illness became more likely in crowded homes. Children were born into the same cycle of risk, repeating the pattern with impressive historical consistency. It is important to note that medieval people were not unaware of death. They lived alongside it constantly. Cemeteries were central features of towns. Religious rituals acknowledged mortality openly and frequently. This familiarity produced acceptance rather than panic. Death was expected, prepared for, and discussed without much surprise. Older children learned practical skills rather than abstract education. Survival mattered more than knowledge. Literacy was rare, but competence was essential. Knowing how to farm, repair, carry, and endure mattered more than long-term planning, because long-term outcomes were never guaranteed. Despite this, medieval childhood was not joyless. Children played, laughed, formed friendships, and developed personalities. The difference was that joy existed alongside risk, not protected from it. Life was fragile, and everyone knew it, including the children, at least eventually. By the time someone reached adulthood, their life expectancy shifted upward significantly. At that point, they had already outlived many of their peers. Survival became a quieter process of avoiding disease, injury, and famine, rather than an immediate struggle to stay alive. In the next part, we will look more closely at adult life, work, and how daily labor quietly shaped how long medieval people could expect to live, assuming nothing went wrong, which, historically speaking, was optimistic. For now, Rest. Childhood alone explains more than half of medieval life expectancy. Everything after that was just additional risk, added slowly, year by year. Adulthood in the Middle Ages was often described, indirectly, as the reward for surviving childhood. This was not entirely accurate. It was more like being promoted from constant crisis to sustained difficulty. You were alive, yes, but now expected to work continuously in order to remain that way. For most medieval adults, life revolved around labor, physical, repetitive, and unavoidable. Farming dominated rural life, and it required long hours in all weather conditions. There were no machines to absorb the strain, no ergonomic tools, and no real concept of preserving the body for later years. Strength was used when it existed, and when it faded, work continued anyway. This constant physical demand wore bodies down quickly. Joints deteriorated, backs curved, hands stiffened. Chronic pain became a normal background condition rather than a medical concern. People did not ask whether this was healthy. They asked whether the harvest would be enough. In towns and cities, work was not much safer. Craftsmen dealt with sharp tools, heavy materials, smoke-filled workshops, and chemical exposure from dyes, tanning processes, and metals. Injuries were common. Treatment consisted of basic wound cleaning, herbs, and hope. Infections followed easily. Survival depended less on skill and more on how the body responded. Nutrition during adulthood remained limited. While adults ate more than children, diets were still monotonous. Bread formed the foundation of most meals. Vegetables filled gaps when available. Meat appeared occasionally, more often for those with status or specific trades. Protein deficiencies were common, even if they were not understood as such. Famine was always close. A poor harvest, bad weather, or conflict could disrupt food supply quickly. When shortages occurred, adults weakened first. This made them more vulnerable to disease, creating a predictable pattern: hunger, illness, death. It repeated often enough to be considered routine. Disease did not discriminate by age, but adults faced different risks. Respiratory illnesses, infections, and fevers circulated constantly. Without effective treatment, recovery depended on rest, nutrition, and chance. Rest was rare. Nutrition was inconsistent. Chance handled the rest. Epidemics periodically erased years of cautious survival. Plague outbreaks, in particular, devastated adult populations. Entire households vanished within weeks. Survivors inherited work, land, and responsibility, but also trauma and exhaustion. Life expectancy statistics absorbed these losses quietly, flattening them into averages. Social class influenced adult survival, but not always predictably. Nobles lived with better food and shelter, but faced violent deaths through warfare and political conflict. Peasants avoided court intrigue but suffered under relentless labor and poor living conditions. Clergy lived longer on average, benefiting from more stable routines and reduced physical strain, though they were not immune to disease. Women's adult life expectancy was shaped heavily by childbirth. Each pregnancy carried risk. Repeated pregnancies increased it. Many women survived several births. Many did not. Even successful childbirth could result in long-term complications that shortened lives gradually rather than dramatically. Marriage created economic stability, but also increased exposure. Crowded homes spread illness. Shared labor meant shared exhaustion. Children added both meaning and risk. Family life improved emotional survival while complicating physical survival. Aging, when reached, was visible and unmistakable. There were no subtle signs of middle age. Physical decline arrived clearly. Older adults worked less, not because they wanted to, but because they could not maintain previous output. Communities relied on extended families rather than formal care. Support existed, but it was limited. There was no retirement. There was only reduced labor until the body failed completely. Old age was respected, but it was not comfortable. Pain accumulated, vision faded, teeth disappeared, hearing declined. These changes were accepted without much complaint because there were no alternatives to compare them to. Mentally, adults adapted well. Medieval people were resilient in ways modern societies often underestimate. They expected hardship. They did not assume improvement. This lowered disappointment and increased endurance. Survival depended as much on mindset as on physical strength. When historians calculate medieval life expectancy, Adult life plays a quieter role than childhood, but it still matters. Deaths in adulthood occurred steadily rather than suddenly, wearing averages down slowly. Each injury, infection, and failed harvest contributed a small adjustment downward. In the next part, we will look more closely at disease itself, how medieval illnesses spread, why they were so deadly, and how little anyone could do about them once they arrived. For now, you can rest, knowing that reaching adulthood in the Middle Ages meant you had already succeeded at something statistically impressive. What followed was not ease, but endurance. And historically speaking, endurance was considered enough. We continue, calmly, into the part where disease does most of the work. Disease in the Middle Ages was not an occasional disruption. It was a permanent background presence, like weather, except less predictable and more personal. People did not ask if illness would arrive. They asked when and whether it would choose them this time. Most medieval diseases were unnamed, poorly understood, and treated with impressive confidence anyway. Symptoms were observed carefully, but causes were guessed. Illness was blamed on bad air, imbalanced humors, divine punishment, planetary alignment, or something unpleasant that had recently happened nearby. Germ theory was not part of the conversation. Neither was prevention, in any meaningful sense. Everyday infections were often fatal. A cut on the hand, a blister on the foot, or a toothache could quietly escalate into a systemic infection. Without antibiotics, the body fought alone. Sometimes it won, sometimes it did not. The difference between recovery and death was often invisible until it was final. Respiratory illnesses were common, especially in cold, damp environments. Smoke-filled homes, poor ventilation, and crowded sleeping arrangements created ideal conditions for chronic coughing, fevers, and lung infections. Recovery required warmth, rest, and nourishment. These were rarely available in sufficient quantities. Waterborne diseases were also widespread. Clean water was difficult to secure, especially in towns where waste disposal was inefficient and rivers served multiple incompatible purposes. Drinking water, washing water, and wastewater frequently came from the same source. Dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and severe diarrhea claimed many lives, especially among children and the elderly. Plague deserves its own quiet mention. When it arrived, it did not negotiate. The Black Death and its recurring outbreaks erased large portions of the population with unsettling speed. Villages lost half their residents. Cities emptied. Life expectancy collapsed temporarily, then resumed its slow, precarious climb afterward, as if nothing had happened. This was not resilience. It was necessity. Medical care existed, but it was limited. Physicians were rare and expensive. Most people relied on local healers, monks, or family members. Treatments included herbal remedies, bloodletting, poultices, prayers, and rest. Some remedies helped. Many did nothing. A few actively made things worse. The line between medicine and ritual was thin and flexible. Hospitals, where they existed, were not places of cure so much as places of care. They offered shelter, food, and spiritual preparation. Survival was not guaranteed, and expectations were modest. Being cared for mattered, even if recovery did not follow. Public health measures were minimal. Quarantines were occasionally attempted during severe outbreaks, but enforcement was inconsistent. People still needed to work, eat, and interact. Isolation was a luxury most could not afford. Disease spread accordingly. Life expectancy statistics absorb disease quietly. They do not show panic, grief, or the sound of coughing in a crowded room at night. They simply record outcomes. Each epidemic pushed averages downward. Each recovery nudged them back up. Over time, the numbers stabilized around a reality shaped by constant exposure. Importantly, disease did not feel random to medieval people. It felt expected. People prepared spiritually more than medically. Religious rituals structured responses to illness. Prayer offered meaning, if not protection. Acceptance reduced fear, even if it did not reduce mortality. Surviving disease often left long-term consequences. Chronic pain, weakness, and disability were common. These conditions reduced work capacity, which in turn reduced access to food and care, creating slow declines rather than sudden deaths. Life expectancy shortened quietly, year by year. Older adults were particularly vulnerable. What might have been a minor illness earlier in life became fatal later on. There was no concept of immune memory or accumulated resilience. There was only a body that had endured enough. Despite this, medieval societies functioned. People continued to marry, work, celebrate holidays, and plan for futures that statistics would not have recommended. Life expectancy did not dictate behavior. It merely described outcomes after the fact. In the next part, we will look at how famine, climate, and environmental instability quietly worked alongside disease to shape medieval lifespans, not dramatically, just consistently. For now, rest. Disease explains much of medieval life expectancy, but not all of it. Hunger and weather were waiting patiently for their turn, still moving slowly. Now, with weather, hunger, and timing, famine in the Middle Ages was not a rare catastrophe. It was a recurring condition that waited politely for the right circumstances. A cold spring, too much rain, too little rain, war in the wrong place, or disease among livestock could all reduce food supply quickly. When this happened, life expectancy adjusted downward without much ceremony. Medieval agriculture depended almost entirely on local conditions. There were no global supply chains, no stored reserves large enough to compensate for failure, and no reliable way to move food long distances efficiently. When crops failed in one region, people there simply ate less, sometimes much less. Hunger weakened the body gradually. At first, people lost weight, then strength, then resistance to illness. Diseases that might have been survived during good years became fatal during bad ones. Famine did not usually kill quickly. It prepared people to die later, from something else. Children suffered first. Malnourished mothers produced weaker infants. Weaning during famine was especially dangerous. Child mortality spiked, pulling life expectancy downward sharply. Adults followed more slowly, enduring until their bodies could no longer compensate. Climate played a constant role. The Middle Ages included periods of relative warmth and stability, followed by colder, wetter phases. The so-called Little Ice Age brought shorter growing seasons and more frequent crop failures. Weather did not announce itself as a crisis. It simply reduced yields year after year. Housing offered limited protection from the elements. Most homes were cold, damp, and poorly insulated. Exposure to cold weakened immune systems and increased respiratory illness. Heating relied on open fires, which added smoke and further respiratory damage. Comfort was not the goal. Survival was. Seasonal hunger was normal. Even in good years, food supplies ran low before the next harvest. This hungry gap meant months of reduced intake. People planned for it, accepted it, and endured it. Life expectancy statistics quietly include these periods of predictable suffering. Environmental instability also increased migration. People moved in search of work or food, spreading disease and placing stress on new communities. Urban centers swelled during hard times, becoming more crowded and less sanitary. Cities offered opportunity and risk in equal measure. Natural disasters added unpredictability. Floods, storms, and harsh winters destroyed crops and homes. Recovery was slow and incomplete. Rebuilding consumed energy and resources that could have supported health. Each disaster left lasting effects, shortening lives indirectly. War compounded these problems. Armies consumed food, destroyed fields, and displaced populations. Even people far from battle suffered from shortages. War did not need to kill directly to reduce life expectancy. Disruption alone was enough. Despite this, medieval societies adapted. People developed strategies for rationing, preservation, and communal support. Grain was stored when possible. Families shared resources. Local charities and religious institutions provided some relief. These efforts reduced suffering but could not eliminate it. Life expectancy reflects averages, not experiences. It does not show the long winters, the empty granaries, or the quiet decisions about who would eat less. It simply records the outcome of repeated environmental stress layered over fragile human bodies. Importantly, famine did not feel exceptional. It felt like part of life. People adjusted expectations accordingly. Long lives were admired, but not assumed. Survival itself was considered a success. In the next part, we will examine how social structure and class influenced who endured these hardships longer and who did not. Privilege helped, but it did not guarantee safety. For now, rest. Hunger and weather shaped medieval life expectancy as reliably as disease. Together, they formed a system that quietly discouraged longevity. Now we move, gently, into class, privilege, and the limited benefits of both. Social class in the Middle Ages influenced life expectancy, but not in the clean, predictable way modern statistics might suggest. Being wealthy improved certain conditions, while introducing new risks that balanced things out with impressive efficiency. Being poor exposed people to constant hardship, but occasionally spared them from the excesses that killed their social superiors. Nobility enjoyed better food, larger living spaces, and protection from the most exhausting forms of labor. They were less likely to starve and more likely to survive childhood. This raised their average life expectancy slightly. Unfortunately, they also spent considerable time participating in warfare, political intrigue, and elaborate banquets, all of which carried risks of their own. Violence shortened many elite lives. Battles, duels, and power struggles were common. Medical care was available, but it was not particularly effective. An injured nobleman often died as easily as a wounded peasant. Status did not protect against infection. Diet among the wealthy was rich, heavy, and repetitive. Excessive meat consumption, limited vegetables, and large quantities of alcohol contributed to chronic illness. Obesity, gout, and cardiovascular problems existed, even if they were not diagnosed as such. These conditions shortened lives gradually rather than dramatically. Peasants lived differently. Their diets were simpler and more plant-based, sometimes unintentionally healthier. Physical labor maintained strength and endurance, but at the cost of joint damage and exhaustion. Their exposure to disease was higher due to crowded living conditions and proximity to animals. Urban populations faced unique risks. Cities concentrated people, waste, and disease. Life expectancy in towns was often lower than in rural areas, especially during epidemics. However, cities also offered access to work, food markets, and medical practitioners, modest as they were. The clergy tended to live longer than average. Monastic life provided regular meals, shelter, and reduced exposure to physical labor and childbirth. Monks and nuns benefited from stable routines and communal support. Literacy and access to written medical texts offered small advantages, though disease still found its way in. Gender intersected with class in complex ways. Noble women faced risks during childbirth, just like peasant women, though they often had better nutrition and assistance. Lower-class women worked physically harder, increasing strain, but sometimes experienced fewer pregnancies due to economic constraints. Children born into higher-status families had better survival rates, but they were not immune to disease. Epidemics ignored rank. Life expectancy for elite children improved slightly, but it remained fragile. Slavery and servitude represented the lowest levels of survival advantage. These individuals faced extreme labor demands, poor nutrition, and limited autonomy. Records are sparse, but life expectancy was likely very low. Survival depended almost entirely on physical resilience. It is tempting to assume that privilege guaranteed longevity. In the Middle Ages, it did not. It shifted the risks rather than removing them. A noble might avoid famine but die in battle. A peasant might survive war but succumb to hunger. Life expectancy balanced these outcomes quietly. Social support mattered. Families and communities provided care for the sick and elderly. Those without support suffered more. Isolation increased mortality. Belonging, even in poverty, improved chances of survival. Life expectancy statistics flatten these differences. They do not show individual stories of endurance or collapse. They summarize outcomes across class lines, smoothing privilege and hardship into a single number that hides more than it reveals. In the next part, we will look at how aging itself was experienced in the Middle Ages and what it meant to grow old in a world that did not expect you to. For now, rest. Class shaped medieval life expectancy, but it never controlled it. Survival remained uncertain for everyone, just distributed differently. Now we slow down even further, into old age, assuming it happened at all. Reaching old age in the Middle Ages was not common enough to feel routine. It was noticeable. An elderly person stood out, not because they were rare in absolute terms, but because they had quietly outlasted many others. Longevity was not celebrated loudly. It was observed, acknowledged, and treated with cautious respect. Old age did not begin at a fixed number. There was no clear transition from adulthood to retirement, because retirement did not exist. Aging was defined by physical decline rather than years lived. When the body slowed down, when strength faded, when pain became constant, a person was considered old, regardless of their actual age. The physical reality of aging was harsh. Decades of labor left joints damaged and backs bent. Arthritis, chronic pain, and limited mobility were common. Vision deteriorated. Hearing faded. Teeth were often lost early, making eating difficult and nutrition worse, which accelerated decline. These conditions were not treated. They were endured. Medical care for the elderly was minimal. There were no specialists, no long-term treatments, and no pain management, as we would understand it today. Relief came in the form of rest, warmth, herbal remedies, and spiritual comfort. Some remedies helped slightly. Many did nothing. None reversed decline. Family support determined much of an elderly person's quality of life. Those who lived within extended families were more likely to be cared for. Children and grandchildren provided food, shelter, and assistance when possible. Those without family support faced significant hardship. Poverty in old age often meant hunger and neglect. Communities sometimes helped. Villages recognized the value of elders as sources of experience and memory. Older people contributed through advice, supervision, childcare, and lighter tasks. They worked until they could not, then shifted roles rather than stopping entirely. Mental resilience often outlasted physical strength. Medieval elders were accustomed to loss, hardship, and uncertainty. This experience created a kind of emotional durability. They did not expect comfort. They expected continuation. This mindset supported survival in ways that are difficult to measure statistically. However, aging increased vulnerability to disease dramatically. Illnesses that might have been survived earlier in life became fatal. Recovery slowed. Complications accumulated. Death in old age was often attributed to vague causes, such as weakness or natural decline, which accurately described the situation without explaining it. Life expectancy statistics rarely reflect this phase clearly. Because so few people reached advanced age, their experiences contribute less to averages than childhood deaths. This creates the impression that medieval people rarely grew old, when in reality some did, quietly and without ceremony. There was no concept of maximizing lifespan. Longevity was not a goal in itself. Survival year by year mattered more than planning decades ahead. Reaching old age was considered fortunate, but not something one could actively pursue through lifestyle changes or medical intervention. Spiritual preparation became more important with age. Older people focused increasingly on religious life, confession, and preparing for death. This was not morbid, it was practical. Death was expected, and preparation provided structure and reassurance. Importantly, old age did not isolate people completely. Elders remained part of the social fabric until the end. They were present in homes, churches, and communal spaces. Aging happened publicly, not hidden away. When death finally arrived, it was rarely dramatic. It came after long decline, quiet illness, or simple exhaustion. Life expectancy statistics record this as an endpoint. Medieval people experienced it as a gradual closing. In the next part, we will look at how medieval people understood life expectancy itself, what they believed about lifespan, fate, and the length of a human life, long before anyone calculated averages. For now, rest. Reaching old age in the Middle Ages was not comfortable, not guaranteed, and not extended. But for those who arrived there, it was accepted calmly, as the final phase of endurance. Now we move into how medieval people understood lifespan itself, without charts, averages, or false reassurance. Medieval people did not think about life expectancy the way we do. There were no numbers to consult, no tables to compare, and no sense that life could be predicted statistically. Instead, lifespan was understood through experience, observation, and belief. People knew how long others tended to live because they watched it happen repeatedly in familiar patterns. Death was not abstract. It was visible. Children died. Adults died. Elders died when they existed. Cemeteries were central, not hidden. Funerals were common events. This constant exposure created a practical understanding of mortality that did not require calculation. People did not ask, "How long will I live?" They asked, "How should I live?" Knowing this, fate played a significant role in how lifespan was interpreted. Many believed that the length of a person's life was determined by God, destiny, or divine will. This belief reduced anxiety, while also discouraging attempts at control. If life was predetermined, there was little point in obsessing over its length. Endurance mattered more than extension. Astrology occasionally entered the conversation. Some believed the stars influenced health, temperament, and longevity. Birth charts were consulted by those who could afford it, though the conclusions were often vague enough to apply to anyone. Astrology did not prevent illness, but it offered explanations, which mattered. Medical theory framed lifespan through balance, rather than duration. The idea of the four humors suggested that health depended on maintaining equilibrium within the body. Aging was seen as a gradual loss of this balance. Once imbalance became severe, death followed. The goal was not long life, but proper balance while life lasted. There was no concept of premature death in the modern sense. A child dying was tragic, but not unexpected. An adult dying was unfortunate, but familiar. Old age was respected precisely because it was not assumed. Longevity felt exceptional rather than normal. Stories and religious texts reinforced this worldview. Biblical figures who lived extraordinarily long lives were seen as exceptions, not benchmarks. Ordinary people did not expect such outcomes. Their lives were framed as brief tests, preparations, or passages rather than extended projects. Work and responsibility reinforced short-term thinking. Planning decades ahead was impractical in a world shaped by unpredictable harvests, disease, and conflict. People planned seasons, not lifetimes. This mindset aligned naturally with uncertain survival. Life expectancy, as we understand it now, would have felt irrelevant. Knowing the average lifespan would not change daily behavior. You still had to work, eat, care for children, and survive winter. Numbers would not make water cleaner or food more plentiful. Importantly, medieval people did not see themselves as living short lives. They saw themselves as living normal lives. Modern comparisons distort this perception. Judging medieval lifespan by contemporary standards creates a sense of deprivation that medieval people did not experience directly. This does not mean they were indifferent to life. They valued it intensely, precisely because it was fragile. Birth, survival, and longevity were all meaningful events. Celebration did not require long duration. It required continuation. Life expectancy statistics flatten belief, experience, and adaptation into a single figure. They tell us what happened, not how it felt. Medieval people lived inside uncertainty rather than measuring it from the outside. As a result, fear of death was often less sharp, though grief remained. Death was familiar enough to be accepted, but still painful enough to matter. This balance shaped how people approached living. In the next part, we will quietly contrast medieval life expectancy with early modern improvements and look at what actually began to change and what stubbornly did not. For now, rest. Medieval people did not count their years the way we do. They counted seasons survived, children raised, and work completed. Duration mattered less than persistence. Still slow. Now we inch forward in time, just slightly, without celebrating too early. When historians compare medieval life expectancy with what came afterward, there is a temptation to describe progress as sudden and dramatic. It was not. Improvements arrived slowly, unevenly, and often without anyone realizing they were living through them. For a long time, medieval conditions simply continued under new labels. The first noticeable changes did not come from medicine. They came from agriculture, trade, and stability. Gradual improvements in farming techniques increased food production in some regions. Crop rotation, better tools, and expanded cultivation reduced the frequency of famine, though they did not eliminate it. Life expectancy responded cautiously, rising by small increments rather than leaps. Urban sanitation improved in limited ways. Waste management became slightly more organized in certain cities. Water access improved marginally. These changes reduced some disease transmission, but not enough to transform daily life. Illness remained common. Death remained familiar. Medical knowledge expanded, but effectiveness lagged behind confidence. Universities trained physicians who studied ancient texts more than living bodies. Treatments remained based on humoral theory, bloodletting, and balance. Survival still depended more on environment and nutrition than on medical intervention. The biggest shift came gradually through reduced child mortality. Even small improvements in infant survival had significant effects on life expectancy averages. Better nutrition for mothers, improved breastfeeding practices, and slightly cleaner environments allowed more children to survive early years. This change alone raised average lifespan noticeably, even if adult life remained difficult. Plague outbreaks became less frequent over time, though they never fully disappeared. When epidemics subsided, populations recovered slowly. Life expectancy rose during these calmer periods, then fell again when disease returned. Progress did not move in a straight line. It drifted. Social stability mattered. Periods of peace allowed consistent food production and reduced displacement. War disrupted everything. Whenever conflict intensified, life expectancy fell again. Survival depended as much on politics as on biology. Importantly, people did not experience these changes as a narrative of improvement. They experienced continuity. Daily life still involved hard work, illness, and uncertainty. Living slightly longer did not feel like progress when conditions remained harsh. Comparisons between medieval and early modern lifespans often exaggerate differences. While averages rose, individual experiences remained fragile. A person might live longer than their grandparents, but still face the same risks. Longevity improved quietly, without comfort following closely behind. The idea of actively extending life still did not exist. People adapted to longer survival rather than aiming for it. Aging remained something that happened, not something to manage. Life expectancy statistics show improvement earlier than lived experience does. Numbers change before culture does. Medieval attitudes toward death persisted well into later periods, even as survival rates improved slightly. This slow transition explains why early modern societies still feel medieval in many ways. The structures that limited lifespan, labor intensity, disease exposure, environmental instability took centuries to dismantle. In the next part, we will look at common misconceptions about medieval life expectancy and why modern interpretations often misunderstand what the numbers actually mean. For now, rest. Change did come, eventually. It just arrived at the same pace medieval people did most things slowly, unevenly, and without much optimism. Now we explore misconceptions about medieval life expectancy, carefully and slowly. Many modern readers assume that the low life expectancy of the Middle Ages meant that most people died young. This is not quite accurate. The statistics reflect averages, heavily influenced by high infant and child mortality. Adults who survived childhood often lived into their 40s, 50s, or beyond. Low averages do not mean universal early death. Stories and popular culture exaggerate hardship, emphasizing dramatic deaths and plagues. While these events were real, they were not the daily experience of everyone. Most people lived ordinary lives, quietly managing work, family, and survival. The mundane nature of existence is rarely captured in textbooks or documentaries. Another misconception is that medieval life was uniformly brutal. Experiences varied by location, class, and circumstance. Rural peasants faced labor and famine. Urban dwellers faced overcrowding and disease. Nobles faced luxury intertwined with risk. Life expectancy statistics merge all these experiences, smoothing over extremes to produce a single number. People often assume medicine or sanitation was entirely absent. In reality, communities developed practical solutions: water management, herbal remedies, communal care. These measures did not guarantee survival, but they did mitigate risks. Life expectancy rose slowly as small interventions accumulated over time. Additionally, the idea that medieval people expected to die young is misleading. Individuals observed survival patterns within families and communities. They understood the fragility of life, but did not assume immediate death. Awareness of mortality shaped behavior, planning, and culture, creating resilience rather than despair. Finally, modern comparisons distort perception. A 30-year life expectancy in the Middle Ages sounds short today, but it is not a literal prediction for every individual. Survival to adulthood dramatically increases expected lifespan. Statistical averages obscure this nuance. In the next part, we will quietly examine how work and daily labor affected adult survival, and why even routine tasks subtly shaped life expectancy over decades. For now, rest. Misunderstandings about medieval life expectancy are mostly about perspective. The numbers are precise, the reality is complex, and the everyday experience was quietly continuous. Now we drift into the quiet influence of work on life expectancy. Daily labor in the Middle Ages was not optional. From sunrise to sunset, people were occupied with tasks necessary for survival. Fields needed tending, animals needed care, homes required maintenance, and food had to be produced, collected, or preserved. This work was relentless and unglamorous, yet it shaped lifespan more than most would realize. Physical strain accumulated slowly. Backs became curved, joints stiffened, hands hardened, muscles weakened over years of repetitive effort, and minor injuries became chronic problems. Work itself was neither kind nor forgiving, but it kept bodies moving, which sometimes helped prevent illness. Endurance was a skill honed by necessity. Work exposed adults to additional hazards. Farmers handled sharp tools, unstable ladders, and animals prone to kicking or biting. Craftsmen and artisans used dangerous equipment with little protective knowledge. Accidents were common. If infections followed, recovery relied on rest, herbal remedies, and a bit of luck. Even small tasks contributed. Carrying water, chopping wood, or tending fires introduced repeated stress and risk of minor injuries that added up over time. Fatigue lowered immunity, making ordinary infections more threatening. Chronic exhaustion was part of the background noise of life. Labor was not distributed evenly. Gender and class influenced workload. Peasant women performed both household and field work, often continuing labor through pregnancy. Noble women oversaw households and supervised labor but were less physically taxed, though they faced different health risks, primarily related to childbirth. Men of all classes encountered strenuous field work, warfare, or apprenticeship duties. Urban labor introduced unique challenges. Crowded workshops, smoke-filled spaces, and repetitive craft work caused respiratory issues, deformities, and long-term injury. The city environment also amplified disease transmission. Despite these hazards, work provided structure, food, and purpose, quietly improving odds of survival compared to inactivity or neglect. Seasonality dictated intensity. Busy periods like planting and harvest demanded extreme effort, while winter offered reduced labor but increased vulnerability to cold and malnutrition. Life expectancy statistics absorb these fluctuations, reflecting gradual wear rather than sudden change. Work also intersected with social norms. Responsibility to family and community demanded continued labor. Even in illness, people contributed what they could. Inadequate performance could threaten status, livelihood, or access to food. Survival was tied to perseverance. The cumulative effect of labor was subtle. It shortened some lives through exhaustion or injury, while sustaining others by maintaining activity and purpose. Life expectancy was less about avoiding work than surviving it. In the next part, we will examine how leisure, rest, and occasional recreation fit into this framework, and why even small pauses mattered quietly for health. For now, rest. In the Middle Ages, work was not optional, and neither was its influence on how long people lived. We continue, slowly, into rest, leisure, and the rare moments of reprieve. Even in a world dominated by work, people occasionally rested. Rest was not structured, luxurious, or guaranteed. It came between labor, during seasonal lulls, or as dictated by illness. Sleep, short as it often was the most critical form of recovery. Medieval people divided their nights into segments, sometimes rising briefly in the dark hours before returning to bed. This pattern is sometimes called segmented sleep, and it allowed bodies to recover in small increments, though rarely fully. Leisure was modest. Children played with simple toys or games, often improvised from natural materials. Adults engaged in minimal recreation, storytelling, music, or communal gatherings. These activities were brief, but they mattered. Laughter, social connection, and distraction provided subtle benefits, reducing stress, which in turn quietly supported survival. Religious observances filled another role. Attendance at church or participation in festivals offered breaks from labor, opportunities for communal support, and psychological relief. Rituals reinforced shared purpose and provided guidance on living, aging, and dying. Spiritual life functioned as both comfort and structure. Hygiene, rest, and minimal leisure collectively influenced life expectancy. Even short pauses could allow minor illnesses to resolve, slow fatigue, or improve mood. These small advantages were never guaranteed, but they quietly affected outcomes across communities. Sleep patterns were intimately tied to work and environmental conditions. People rose with daylight, worked during available hours, and slept when possible. Lack of modern lighting meant evenings were long, yet filled with modest tasks: mending, preparing food, or tending animals indoors. Sleep and activity intertwined, creating a rhythm that supported survival more than comfort. Mental endurance mattered. Knowledge that work, illness, and risk were continuous cultivated resilience. Individuals adapted strategies to conserve energy, distribute effort, and cope with uncertainty. Life expectancy statistics record outcomes, but they cannot capture this internal adaptation, which shaped day-to-day survival. Even minimal leisure mattered because it permitted observation, learning, and skill development. Children who played, learned, and explored were more likely to navigate adulthood successfully. Adults who participated in social or ritual events maintained social networks that helped during illness or famine. Isolation increased vulnerability. In addition, seasonal rest influenced survival subtly. Winters brought shorter workdays, allowing for recovery. Summers demanded endurance, but bodies acclimated gradually. Life expectancy reflected this slow adjustment, absorbing the interplay between labor and rest. In the next part, we will quietly examine nutrition, its constraints, and its profound effect on medieval longevity. Even minimal improvements in diet mattered more than any ceremonial intervention or advice from physicians. For now, rest. Medieval life had brief moments of relief, but these small respites quietly shaped whether survival continued, imperceptibly lengthening some lives. Now we drift into nutrition, slowly and deliberately. Food in the Middle Ages was simple, repetitive, and often insufficient. Diet determined survival more than most realized. Bread, grains, and occasionally vegetables formed the bulk of meals. Meat appeared rarely, depending on wealth, season, or luck. Even nobles consumed monotonous fare, though with greater quantity and variety. Malnutrition was common. Deficiencies in protein, vitamins, and minerals weakened immune systems, making ordinary infections more deadly. Chronic hunger subtly shortened life, not dramatically, but steadily. Survival depended on the balance between intake, work, and illness. Seasonal variation dictated access to food. Spring often brought scarcity after winter stores were exhausted. Summer and early autumn offered abundance. Winters were long, cold, and resource-limited. Food scarcity shaped daily life, not just for children, but for adults and the elderly. Life expectancy statistics quietly absorbed these seasonal fluctuations. Preparation and storage were crucial. Grains were stored in rudimentary granaries. Preservation techniques included drying, salting, and fermenting, all imperfect. Spoilage was common. A failed harvest or contaminated storage could create famine conditions, disproportionately affecting the weakest members of society. Feasts and special meals were rare, but culturally important. Religious holidays and local festivals offered access to richer foods, alcohol, and indulgence. These events had minimal effect on long-term survival but provided brief relief, both physically and psychologically. Food quality also varied with geography and trade. Coastal regions enjoyed more fish. Inland areas relied heavily on grains. Trade occasionally introduced spices or luxury goods, but these did not significantly improve nutrition for most people. What mattered was sustenance, not flavor. Children were particularly vulnerable to dietary insufficiency. Weaning often coincided with exposure to contaminated water or poor quality food. Growth was stunted in many cases. Those who survived childhood carried nutritional deficits into adulthood, subtly influencing health and longevity. The elderly experienced declining food intake naturally. Teeth were lost, digestion weakened, and appetite declined. Nutrition remained critical, but the ability to absorb and utilize it decreased. Life expectancy statistics silently incorporate these limitations, which modern readers may not immediately appreciate. Nutrition interacted with disease, work, and rest. Adequate food allowed labor and recovery. Insufficient food amplified exhaustion, infection risk, and injury consequences. Every meal, or lack thereof, influenced survival over decades. In the next part, we will examine childbirth and its critical role in female life expectancy, exploring the quiet but constant risks for women in medieval society. For now, Rest. Nutrition was not luxurious. It was functional, repetitive, and central to life expectancy in ways often unnoticed, shaping medieval survival subtly but persistently. Now we drift gently into childbirth and its influence on female life expectancy. For medieval women, childbirth was a constant and profound risk. Pregnancy itself consumed energy, taxed the body, and introduced danger. Labor was unpredictable. Complications that modern medicine treats easily: bleeding, infection, obstructed labor, often proved fatal. Even women who survived multiple births faced long-term health consequences. Childbirth mortality was highest for first-time mothers and for those bearing children closely together. Midwives assisted where possible, but knowledge was limited. Tools were basic, interventions minimal, and luck mattered more than skill. Surviving each birth was quietly celebrated, though seldom recorded in statistics beyond the life expectancy numbers. Pregnancy also interacted with nutrition and workload. Malnourished women or those engaged in heavy labor faced higher mortality. The demands of fieldwork, domestic duties, and child-rearing compounded physical strain. Rest was rare, and support was inconsistent. Life expectancy statistics silently absorbed these compounded risks. Child mortality affected mothers indirectly. A mother who lost a child faced both emotional strain and social pressure to bear more offspring. Each successive pregnancy carried incremental risk, quietly reducing long-term survival chances. Urban and rural conditions influenced outcomes differently. Urban women had closer access to healers or midwives, but were exposed to crowded, unsanitary conditions that increased infection risk. Rural women had more space and possibly better nutrition, but fewer trained assistants. Both environments were precarious in their own ways. Widows often faced unique challenges. Without a husband's labor and protection, they had to manage households and fields while maintaining survival. Their life expectancy was influenced by workload, access to food, and community support. Social structures cushioned some risks, but not all. The cumulative effect of pregnancy, labor, and repeated childbirth quietly shaped female life expectancy. It is not dramatic in one event, but gradual across decades. Women who survived into later adulthood had endured multiple layers of risk, each subtly lowering statistical averages. Religious and cultural rituals provided guidance and reassurance. Women sought blessings, prayers, and protective charms during pregnancy and labor. These practices had no medical effect, but they offered psychological comfort, which could influence resilience, subtly affecting survival. Life expectancy statistics reflect both the risk of death and the survival of those who endured. Female averages are therefore slightly lower than male averages in many regions, primarily due to childbirth. The difference is not enormous, but it is consistent across medieval populations. In the next part, we will examine common diseases and how they interacted with women's health, quietly shaping survival probabilities over the long term. For now, rest. Childbirth was neither heroic nor exceptional. It was ordinary, persistent, and quietly lethal in shaping medieval life expectancy. Now we continue, slowly, into disease patterns and their impact on survival for both men and women. In the Middle Ages, disease was a constant companion. Some illnesses were endemic, present year after year, quietly reducing life expectancy. Others arrived in waves, epidemics sweeping communities with alarming speed. Fever, dysentery, respiratory infections, and plague were common threats, unpredictable yet familiar. Adults of both genders were affected, but consequences differed slightly. Women faced compounded risks when pregnancy intersected with illness. Even minor infections could become fatal if nutrition, workload, or immune strength were insufficient. Men faced physical hazards that exposed them to injuries, which in turn became entry points for infections. Transmission was often facilitated by living conditions. Crowded homes, shared beds, proximity to animals, and contaminated water sources created efficient pathways for disease. Urban centers, while offering trade and opportunity, also concentrated risks. Rural populations experienced slower spread but had limited medical care. Treatment remained rudimentary. Physicians relied on humoral theory, bloodletting, herbal remedies, and prayers. Some remedies offered mild relief, but few cured. The outcome depended largely on the patient's resilience, environment, and fortune. Plague outbreaks deserve quiet attention. When the Black Death struck, Mortality rates rose dramatically, sometimes wiping out half of a town. Survivors inherited labor, land, and responsibility, but also grief and societal disruption. Life expectancy statistics absorb these fluctuations, which could temporarily depress averages before stabilizing. Disease interacted with famine, labor, and sanitation. Malnutrition weakened resistance. Exhaustion reduced immunity. Poor hygiene facilitated spread. The cumulative effect subtly but persistently reduced survival probabilities. Children, again, were particularly vulnerable. Early exposure often led to lifelong weakness or fatality. Those who survived gained experience and resistance, subtly shaping adult life expectancy. Religious practices mitigated psychological stress, though not physical illness. Prayer, confession, and rituals provided comfort. They did not prevent disease but helped people endure, quietly influencing resilience and survival indirectly. Social networks mattered. Families, neighbors, and guilds offered care for the sick. Isolation increased risk. Community support sometimes determined whether an illness proved fatal. Life expectancy statistics reflect these social dynamics only indirectly. Understanding medieval disease requires patience. It did not act in isolation. Work, nutrition, childbirth, and environment combined to determine outcomes. Death was rarely sudden, except in epidemics. More often, survival diminished slowly, cumulatively, over years. In the next part, we will explore the psychological and cultural acceptance of mortality, and how medieval people's understanding of death shaped their approach to living. For now, rest. Disease was omnipresent, persistent, and quietly decisive in shaping medieval life expectancy. Now we move slowly into mindset, culture, and the quiet acceptance of mortality. Medieval people lived with death as an ever-present reality. Unlike modern societies, where mortality is often abstracted, it was visible, routine, and acknowledged daily. Funerals were frequent, cemeteries were central, and illness could strike suddenly. This constant exposure shaped attitudes toward life and survival. Acceptance of mortality influenced behavior. People understood that danger was constant. Disease, famine, childbirth, and accidents were expected. Planning focused on immediate survival rather than long-term ambition. This perspective reduced panic and allowed for measured responses to risk. Life expectancy statistics record outcomes, but not the calm acceptance that accompanied them. Religious beliefs framed life and death. Divine will, fate, and spiritual preparation guided decisions. Death was understood as inevitable, and a life well lived was measured in survival, family, work, and piety, rather than duration alone. Rituals and prayers provided comfort, structured routines, and communal cohesion. Communities reinforced these attitudes. Elders shared wisdom about survival, children observed mortality, and social norms emphasized endurance. Grief was present but managed. Loss was frequent but expected. This normalization helped individuals maintain resilience despite fragile circumstances. Cultural understanding also influenced medical practices. Remedies, rituals, and preventative measures were often intertwined with spiritual belief. Confidence in treatments mattered as much as efficacy. Psychological reassurance supported endurance, quietly affecting survival in subtle ways that statistics cannot capture. Death's visibility shaped social priorities. Work, family, and community were central. Education, leisure, and religious practice were interwoven with survival. Long-term planning was rare. Short-term adaptation was constant. Life expectancy statistics reflect average outcomes, but the lived experience emphasized persistence rather than longevity. Individuals internalized mortality differently based on age, gender, and class. Children learned early to adapt. Adults developed strategies for balancing labor, nutrition, and risk. Women navigated childbirth and domestic responsibilities alongside environmental hazards. Men faced labor, warfare, and accidents. Each group experienced life expectancy differently, but acceptance of mortality was universal. Life expectancy was a quiet backdrop, not a driving concern. Survival was measured in seasons endured, meals obtained, and children raised. Aging, decline, and eventual death were expected, and the pace of life reflected that rhythm. In the next part, we will examine social networks, community support, and how interdependence subtly improved chances of survival in the face of constant risk. For now, rest. Medieval people lived with death not as an abstraction, but as a practical companion, shaping behavior, resilience, and the slow, quiet realities of life expectancy. Now we drift into social networks, interdependence, and quiet survival strategies. Survival in the Middle Ages was rarely a solitary endeavor. Families, neighbors, and local communities formed the backbone of support, quietly influencing life expectancy. Cooperation in work, shared resources, and communal care mitigated some risks that statistics alone cannot capture. Households were extended. Multiple generations lived together, pooling labor and knowledge. Elders guided younger family members, while adults supported children and each other in daily survival tasks. This network reduced vulnerability, especially for the young and the sick. Life expectancy numbers quietly reflect these subtle benefits without highlighting them explicitly. Neighborhood support mattered too. Villagers shared food during shortages, helped with childcare, and assisted during illness. Religious institutions supplemented these networks, offering shelter, care, and sometimes rudimentary medical attention. Isolation, conversely, increased risk, demonstrating the practical value of interdependence. Communal labor was common. Collective efforts during harvest, construction, and defense allowed individuals to conserve energy while completing essential tasks. Such cooperation was not motivated by health statistics but by necessity, yet it quietly supported survival. Information sharing helped as well. Knowledge about disease outbreaks, safe water sources, or agricultural techniques spread through communities, reducing exposure to predictable hazards. This local intelligence was more effective than any distant advisory because it was immediate, practical, and applied collectively. Social norms reinforced these behaviors. Reciprocity was expected. Families and neighbors who supported one another increased their chances of survival. Those who failed to participate risked isolation, hunger, or decreased protection during epidemics. Social cohesion, therefore, had life-extending consequences, though rarely acknowledged in contemporary records. Even celebrations and festivals served practical functions: temporary relief from labor, access to food, and reinforcement of communal ties contributed indirectly to endurance. Social enjoyment subtly bolstered morale, which, in turn, affected resilience to daily hardships. In sum, life expectancy in the Middle Ages was shaped not only by disease, nutrition, and labor, but also by the quiet structure of social networks. Support, cooperation, and interdependence created a buffer against the harsh realities of survival, influencing outcomes gradually over a lifetime. In the next part, we will explore urban versus rural life and how environment subtly determined exposure to risk and longevity. For now, rest. Survival was as much about who you relied on as what you endured individually. Now we drift slowly into the differences between urban and rural life in the Middle Ages. Where one lived mattered quietly, but profoundly, for survival. Rural life offered space, fresh air, and proximity to food sources, but it also demanded continuous, exhausting labor. Farms required daily attention, animals needed care, and harvests depended entirely on weather and toil. Famine and seasonal variation were persistent threats. Life expectancy statistics reflect these hardships indirectly. Urban life was different. Cities offered trade, community, and access to services, but they concentrated people, waste, and disease. Crowded homes, shared water sources, and poor sanitation facilitated the spread of infection. Epidemics often struck towns first, leaving rural populations temporarily safer, though still vulnerable. Work in urban environments was specialized. Craftsmen, merchants, and laborers engaged in repetitive tasks that could injure the body over time. Smoke-filled workshops, heavy lifting, and chemical exposure introduced risks absent in the countryside. Accidents and infections were common, subtly affecting life expectancy. Nutrition varied as well. Rural households often relied on self-produced food grains, vegetables, occasional meat, but faced scarcity during poor harvests. Urban residents had access to markets but depended on others for supply, creating vulnerability during price spikes, war, or famine. Both environments carried risk, but the type differed. Social networks also differed. Rural families were closely knit, with multi-generational households providing support. Cities relied on guilds, neighbors, and charitable institutions. Isolation in either setting could be fatal, particularly during illness or food shortages. Environmental hazards played a role. Rural areas were exposed to weather, wild animals, and labor accidents. Cities exposed residents to fire, pollution, and crowded conditions. Life expectancy numbers smooth over these differences, presenting a single average, but lived experience varied. Epidemics highlight contrasts. Plagues spread faster in towns, but survivors benefited from denser social support and sometimes more accessible medical attention. Rural populations were slower to experience outbreaks, but had fewer coping mechanisms when they did occur. In both settings, endurance mattered more than comfort. Daily life required adaptation to surroundings, constant labor, and navigation of risk. Survival depended on understanding one's environment, pacing work, and leveraging social networks. In the next part, we will look at how seasonal cycles, weather, planting, harvest, quietly influenced mortality and life expectancy. For now, rest. Whether urban or rural, medieval life demanded constant attention, adaptation, and endurance. Environment shaped survival, quietly and persistently. Now we drift slowly into seasonal cycles and their subtle influence on survival. Seasons dictated the rhythm of medieval life. Spring brought planting, long hours in the field, and hope for a good harvest. Summer demanded intense labor, tending crops, and managing livestock. Autumn offered relief through harvest completion, though it also required processing, storage, and preparation for winter. Winter was harsh, cold, and quiet, with minimal labor but limited food. These cycles influenced mortality gradually. Winter exposed people to cold, disease, and food shortages. Spring brought risk of overwork during planting, which could weaken the body and increase susceptibility to illness. Summer heat and labor could cause dehydration or exhaustion. Autumn stress was subtle but cumulative. Life expectancy absorbed these seasonal pressures quietly, year after year. Children and the elderly were particularly sensitive. Cold, hunger, and disease in winter often claimed the most vulnerable. Labor-intensive seasons affected adults differently, but everyone experienced cumulative stress over decades. Survival was a measure of endurance through cycles rather than single catastrophic events. Seasonal scarcity shaped nutrition. Grain stores dwindled in late winter and early spring. Food variety improved only slightly after the harvest. Famine risk fluctuated with weather and agricultural yield, subtly lowering life expectancy when shortages occurred. Festivals and religious observances often coincided with agricultural cycles, offering temporary respite, communal support, and small improvements in food access. These brief interludes provided psychological and nutritional relief, modestly supporting survival. Environmental hazards also shifted with seasons. Floods, storms, and drought could strike unpredictably, compounding routine risks. Individuals adapted cautiously, paced labor, and relied on community knowledge to survive. Life expectancy statistics absorb these variations without highlighting the underlying rhythm. Ultimately, seasonal cycles shaped medieval life quietly but relentlessly. Work, nutrition, and environmental risk were intertwined, producing patterns of survival that statistics compress into simple averages. Life expectancy reflected this slow, persistent negotiation with nature. In the next part, we will conclude by summarizing the cumulative factors: childhood mortality, disease, nutrition, labor, social support, and environment that shaped life expectancy in the Middle Ages. For now, rest. Seasons passed predictably, yet always carried risk. Survival depended on enduring them, quietly and consistently. Now we conclude, slowly tying together all the threads of medieval life expectancy. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was shaped by a complex web of factors, quietly interacting over decades. Childhood mortality, disease, nutrition, labor, childbirth, social networks, environment, and seasonal cycles all contributed to outcomes. Statistics summarize these effects, but they cannot capture the lived experience of enduring them day by day. Childhood remained the most critical filter. Surviving infancy and early years drastically improved odds of adulthood. Disease and famine claimed many young lives. while resilience and family support allowed others to persist. Those who reached adulthood had already achieved a notable statistical advantage. Adult survival was influenced by labor, nutrition, and environment. Work demanded constant effort, exposing individuals to accidents and exhaustion. Diets were simple, seasonal, and often insufficient, subtly affecting immunity and long-term health. Urban and rural settings offered different challenges and supports, each shaping outcomes quietly. Childbirth carried persistent risk for women, compounded by labor and nutrition. Disease struck indiscriminately, but social support, community care, and religious practices offered subtle buffers that improved survival odds. Life expectancy statistics incorporate these effects, though they rarely reveal the resilience and adaptation underlying them. Elders, when reached, experienced physical decline, chronic pain, and vulnerability to disease. Life continued in reduced capacity, socially and economically, until death arrived quietly, often after long preparation. The acceptance of mortality shaped behavior, social structures, and culture, reinforcing endurance over expectation of longevity. Seasons dictated labor, nutrition, and exposure to environmental hazards. Repetition of cycles created slow, cumulative effects on survival, absorbed by bodies and communities alike. Festivals, religious rituals, and leisure moments offered minor relief, subtly supporting endurance. Across all social classes, life expectancy reflected both risk and resilience. Nobles, peasants, clergy, and artisans each faced different hazards, yet survival depended on adaptation, cooperation, and perseverance rather than privilege alone. Average lifespans hide the complex interplay of these factors, compressing centuries of subtle survival strategies into a single number. Modern readers may misinterpret low medieval life expectancy as universal early death, but this is misleading. Many adults lived decades beyond childhood. Life expectancy statistics are a summary of risk, not a measure of personal destiny. Understanding the quiet realities of survival provides a more accurate and contemplative perspective. In the end, medieval life expectancy was neither heroic nor tragic in the sense we imagine today. It was ordinary, relentless, and shaped by factors beyond individual control. Survival was cumulative, quiet, and patient. People endured, adapted, and continued, year by year, season by season. Rest now. The Middle Ages remind us that life expectancy is a statistical whisper of endurance, not a loud declaration. Surviving, quietly, was already remarkable.